Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, La ilaha illallah.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Dear respected elders and brothers, ulama, mothers and sisters, this topic about akhlaq and winning the hearts and minds of people through akhlaq, normally when a person gives a lecture or a talk, it always is a precedent that they should be an expert in that particular topic. And akhlaq is such a thing that I think that really it was only Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam who was the perfect expert, who was the one that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose, and the rest of us in the ummah have been enriched by his example, that if it wasn't for his example, that the ummah per se would not have achieved anything of what it did achieve in the last 1,400 plus years. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala embodied, as we have heard in the last few weeks, perfect akhlaq in Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Character, qualities. Qualities can be divided into two categories: physical qualities and those which are the moral and spiritual qualities of a person. Physical qualities a person inherits from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're a thing that he acquires at birth. Some people strong, some people mentally very astute, strong memories, etc., etc. And then the moral and the spiritual qualities are something which which all of us can acquire. And it is through deen and the instrument of deen that we are able to bring about qualities in us which we otherwise would not have. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sent to perfect qualities, meaning that every individual is born with some qualities. It is not that because a person is not Muslim perhaps, or is not from a particular cultural background, therefore that they are devoid of qualities. And we tend to be prejudiced in this way, and we tend to make presumptions to this effect. The reality is that everyone is born with qualities, and sometimes people who don't necessarily have iman can sometimes have excellent qualities, because qualities like rizq are things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala distributes amongst his creation according to his wisdom. Some are given more, some are given less, just like rizq, and qualities are the same. It is the life example of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that becomes the blueprint or the template whereby we can then take the qualities that we have and expand them to their maximum potential. And this is precisely what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did. That he took those, that is the Sahaba, who the people of the Arab Peninsula, and of course others as well who came from other places like Salman radhiyallahu anhu and Suhaib from Rome and Bilal from Habasha. Those who were there, who were destined, who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had chosen, who blessed to become his companions, that he, by his example and guided of course directly by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, took whatever qualities they had and brought them to their full potential. And then once the ummah had reached a level whereby their qualities had reached their maximum potential, then they became the most powerful tools in the history of mankind to win the hearts and the minds of people all over the world. Hence the spread of Islam within 150 years to virtually the four corners of the world. I mean, the history that we most often are given, that is disseminated to us, is generally very Eurocentric history. But the reality is that when the Sahaba had reached the level that they had reached, when they were there at Hajjatul Wida, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam asked them three questions. Asked them, what place is this, what day is this? What month is this, what place is this, what day is this? And to each question the Sahaba replied, Allah wa Rasul alam. I mean, these were things which, as we would say in Australian slang, no-brainers. That people who had come from all the corners of the Arab Peninsula and had been travelling for days if not weeks, and knew very well that it was the month of Dhul Hijjah, knew very well that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had declared that he was performing Hajj, and had come prepared for such a thing, and at the limits where, as anybody who has performed Hajj would know, the miqat where you now put on the ihram, know now that there is a deadline, that you have to be in Arafah by the 9th of Dhul Hijjah. Know now which place you are going to. These things, they are no-brainers, like I said. Everyone is now focused on the plain of Arafah on the 9th day of the month of Dhul Hijjah. And astonishingly, it would seem, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam asks them, what day is this? What month is this? What place is this? They've been traveling towards it, focusing on it for days if not weeks. Because obviously travel in those days took, by foot and by camel, was stretched out to weeks. And more astonishingly, the reply of the Sahaba was, to each question, Allah wa Rasuluhu alam. Allah and His Prophet, they know best. The Sahaba had reached such a level of obedience to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where they had become the embodiment of his teachings. That now, whatever Allah and His Rasul have ordered us to do, that we accept. And at any stage, if Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam chooses to teach us something extra or to change for argument's sake, whatever the case may be, we accept, because Allah and His Rasul, they know best. From this, the ulama who say that the Sahaba had reached the Hajjatul Wida, and this small example is like, by today's equivalent, if you like, a graduation ceremony, where you have reached a position whereby now your akhlaq, your iman, your qualities have reached such a perfect state now that you are export quality. And that from this place, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells them that those who have not, that basically, that more or less the meaning, that you take this message to those who are not present. Now those who are not present is not inferred those people who for whatever reason couldn't perform Hajj that year. But it extends to each and every single living individual, not only in that time that was on the surface of the earth, but to the last day. And when these individuals now travelled with the qualities that they had acquired from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the sifat, the akhlaq, based on that pure and perfect iman that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had taught them, that tawheed, the oneness of Allah, and so on and so forth, wherever they went in the world, it won the hearts of the people. It completely transformed nations and cultures and civilizations. So much so that they did not just accept their faith or their theology or their ideology, but today those countries that we refer to as Arab countries, we refer to as, let's start from what's closest to the Arab Peninsula. You have Palestine, and you have Lebanon, and you have Iraq, and you have Egypt, and so on and so forth. We all call them today Arab countries. The reality is, in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not one single one of these countries was an Arab country. Neither did they speak Arabic, nor did they have any of the culture that we know today to be what is Islamic and what is Arab culture. They didn't just accept belief in one Allah, but they were so impressed and so overwhelmed by the character, the qualities, that level of perfection in the lives of the Sahaba, from the teacher, the master, the best example himself, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that from that era onwards, their language, their faith, their culture, their habits, their demeanor, their behavior was completely transformed. Their hearts and their minds were won over entirely. So much so that in one incident where Khalid bin Walid radiallahu anhu was sent into Syria, and a time came where Umar radiallahu anhu ordered Khalid that he should he's required as reinforcements to another part in the Khilafah. And when this contingent was deputed then from Syria to go to another part of the Khilafah, Khalid radiallahu anhu gave back to the inhabitants of Syria who were not Muslims at that time. Not everyone was Muslim all at once, but it was a process, and it was a very interesting process, that he gave back the jizya to the non-Muslims. And the non-Muslims, they queried as to why you were giving back this jizya, which is loosely translated as a tax, right? That those non-Muslim subjects of the Muslim Khilafah, they should pay a small amount, really it's a very small amount, to the Khilafah for protection. That not only you are our subjects, but it is our responsibility to look after and to protect your welfare. That anybody comes and attacks from the outside, we are your shield. We as Muslims will put our lives and our blood between you and your enemy. And these things are unfathomable sometimes when we consider the context of some of the deluded ideas that have cropped up in recent history, you know, especially amongst the Muslims. Now, when this money was returned to the Christians in Syria, the Christians came out with an outpour of emotion. They didn't want the Muslims to go. They didn't want their money back, and they didn't want the Muslims to leave. So much so that on more than one occasion there was a saying that during the Turkish Khilafah, better the turban of the Sultan than the cap of the pontiff, of the Pope, because they found more justice unequivocally from the Muslims than what they did from their own kind, their own faith, their own people. Jizya, for example, if I remember correctly, and it's mentioned in the Umdat Salik, is the minimum is, according to the Ahnaf, is one gold coin, one dinar per annum, and one dinar is something like 4.4 grams of gold, right? Nothing. You're talking 1/7 of an ounce, right? And if an ounce, a US ounce, is worth what, 1,200 American dollars? So 1/7 is what, less than 200 American dollars? So you look at $200 a year is your tax? Is this really a tax? We're not talking 38 cents in the dollar, you know, or GST 10%. We're talking such a frugal amount. It was a token amount. But through the deen of Allah and through the akhlaq of those who practice the deen of Allah and those who practice it properly, that was first and foremost Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Sahaba, hearts and minds were won to such an extent that it didn't take 1,000 years, but within decades, the history of mankind was completely transformed. Traders went to China. Today, hundreds of millions of Muslims are there in China. Chinese who are Muslims. Traders went to Indonesia, the most populous Muslim country in the world. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave hidayat, so much so that without the single drawing of a sword, there's no, historical context whereby marauding armies came brandishing their swords and came and took over Indonesia. It was through akhlaq. It was through the character and the qualities of the traders that came, that people were not used to. People in China were not used to people who weighed correctly and didn't cheat and didn't lie and didn't steal. People in Indonesia the same. So much so they were so impressed that the hearts and the minds changed. When the Sahaba moved, first and foremost, in the environment of the company of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the da'wah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, grew the root of Iman. And from this root of Iman grew the trunk of ibadah, worshipping one Allah, only one Allah, learning how to make that connection with Allah. And the first of all the major pillars of Islam, the Salah, which came after 10 odd years. And then from this foundation, from the trunk of ibadah, grow the branches of amal as-salih, good deeds. And from the branches of amal as-salih grow the fruits of akhlaq. And inside the fruits of akhlaq is the nectar, the juice, the sweetness of ikhlas. And this is what distinguishes the person of iman who has akhlaq and the person without iman who has akhlaq. That the person of iman who has akhlaq has ikhlas. He is doing for Allah. If there is no ikhlas, if there is no doing for Allah, then without discrediting those people who don't have iman, it is purely confined to this worldly life. The akhlaq, take for example the hospitality industry, as opposed to what your grandfather and my grandfather did. Your grandfather and my grandfather would accept any stranger that walked through the village. They didn't ask him his name, they didn't ask him his religion, they didn't ask him any questions whatsoever. My mother said, any Husa and Hasul, any Hassan, any Hussein that was walking on the street in the village, they would have a designated room in the house, and we're not talking houses like today where mashallah 4 or 5 bedrooms. There would be a designated room in the house. It would be for the musafir. And to that extent were they not prejudiced, and accepted anyone to come and stay, because it is the right of the traveller. It is the akhlaq of a Muslim. It is what wins the hearts of people. That sometimes the morning after the traveller would come and stay, they would feed him, they would give him a place to stay, all his needs would be fulfilled. In these villages there were no such things as hotels and restaurants. There was no need. In the time of Sahaba, when somebody came, or shortly thereafter the time of the Sahaba, and somebody came to establish a restaurant or a motel from non-Muslim countries in a Muslim country, the local Muslims looked at them astonished and said, what do you think you're doing? Who's going to stay when every single house is open to them? Their food is for them and their house is for them. That in the village of my grandfather, when a traveller would go past, to that extent that the next morning they would find lice in the sheets and they would have to burn the sheets. And even that wouldn't deter them from accepting musafirin into their houses. When the Sahaba travelled, and they took these qualities with them, qualities that we learnt that without Islam we wouldn't have, then the hearts and the minds of the people were changed. First the Sahaba, as they travelled, they went and they gave dawah by words, which of course is easy for anyone to do. But their da'wah by words, of course, had a completely different impact. If, despite their strength, words was not enough, then they would come to an agreement with the people of that nation, that country. They would say that what we will do now, we will impose a jizya upon you. You accept jizya, and like I said, a meager amount, and you allow our troops to pass through your country, our mujahideen to pass through your country, because this message has to reach the 4 corners of the world. Now what is the wisdom behind jizya? Allah does not need taxes, and the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam does not need taxes. You have now a peace treaty between yourself and those who are not Muslims, be it of any faith whatsoever. Now, with jizya, it's specific to the Ahl Kitab. Now you have a treaty with these people, and your troops now freely pass through their countries. Now troops, as they move and as they pass from one place to another place, one village to another village, historically what happens normally? When a conquering army comes, what do? They maraud, they pillage, they take whatever they want. And it is very, very rare that you get an army that passes through a country that doesn't do these things, that doesn't take advantage of absolute power, because absolute power corrupts absolutely. So therefore there is all sorts of atrocities committed. Now there's the opportunity for Muslims to pass through this land, and like anyone else, they have to eat, they have to sleep, they have to have their needs fulfilled, and they go through these places as a superpower, dealing with these people in the most amicable way, in the most just way. They don't steal anything, they don't touch their women, they don't burn their crops, they don't loot their shops. There's no looting, there's no pillaging, there's no raping. And though the old people may not necessarily accept Islam, But what happens is the old people then, they will acknowledge the akhlaq of the Muslims. And they will say that these people, they are better than us. These people, they have good akhlaq, and they are better than our own people. Hence the saying, the better the turban of the sultan than the cap of the pontiff, cap of the pope. Now, little ears are listening, and little ears are paying attention to what the elders in their own society are saying. The reason I'm pointing this out is that when we lost our akhlaq as an ummah, when we lost contact with the akhlaq of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we started to follow our base desires when it came to our dealings with other people, when it came to dealings with non-Muslims, when it came to dealings with our business partners and our colleagues and our associates, when it came to dealing with our wives, when we lost our akhlaq, unfortunately the time has come where we find an example in those who don't have iman and in their akhlaq. To that extent that when these foreign ideologies, un-Islamic ideologies spread throughout the world, like the British Empire and the Dutch and so on and so forth, they took with them a culture, they took with them so many things which they imparted and imposed, either willingly or unwillingly, on others. It was always the youth that first picked up these things, because they were seen to be not only strong in terms of military might, but in terms of akhlaq they were seen to be, not necessarily, they didn't have the akhlaq of us as far as hospitality and so on and so forth goes, but they didn't have the corruption that the Muslims had. We lost ourselves when we lost our akhlaq, and we stopped changing the hearts of others towards Allah when we lost our akhlaq. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Mecca, he is in a position of weakness, worldly weakness, and maybe we feel the same. We are not in a strong position. Propaganda is against us, and we are battling uphill. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is in Mecca, and he is surrounded by the propaganda of the mashayikh, so much so that by the propaganda of the Quraysh, so much so that the Quraysh posted at the entrance, at each entrance to Mecca, a person to warn travelers that were coming into Mecca, there is a young man and he is saying such and such, he is reviling our gods and so, because everyone that is coming into Mecca is coming with their gods or to revere their gods which are already there and so on and so forth. There is a man that is coming into Mecca and he is saying such and such and he is doing such and such and he is dividing the nation and he is undermining our culture, so don't listen to him. The propaganda machine in Mecca was full on, 24/7 it was working. People were stationed on the outside of Mecca, and as musafirs, as the pilgrims were coming into the city, they were being forewarned, they were being loaded. Don't listen to this man, don't listen to this man. And though you can't, not everyone knew Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam by face, because it was a large town, just the same way that you can't possibly know everyone in Karabi. So one day Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was walking, and old lady was carrying her firewood on her back. She was an old lady, she was a poor lady. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam took it upon himself and carried that firewood for her to some far reaches outside of the town. And when they reached to the doorstep of her house, her humble home, like I said, she was poor, she was old, she had nothing to offer him out of gratitude. But she said, look, the only thing I can give you is advice. As an elderly person, I can advise you, listen, I've heard from the elders in our society, from the dignitaries in our society, they're saying that there is such a person and he's doing such and such and he's doing so and so. Beware of him. You're a young man, you're a very nice man, and this is the best that I can give you advice. And his name is Muhammad, and he's like this and like this. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, I am Muhammad. Immediately she accepts Islam. Even in a position of weakness, despite all the propaganda, despite all the, the slander and the libel and everything that may go against us, akhlaq transcends all these things and completely shatters in one swoop whatever is there, the preconceived ideas in the mind of the person, because when they see a living example in front of them, they have to reconcile now things that they have heard which are hearsay about a person they don't know, and a living example of something which is completely contradictory to what they've heard. A young man, a gentle man, a person with excellent akhlaq. Bilal radiallahu anhu is a third category slave. Three types of slaves. You get the house slave, the one, like a butler. In the southern part of the United States during the slave years, he would be finely dressed, he would be in the house, he would be serving, the masters and so on and so forth. First category slave. Second category slave, working out in the fields, right? Not such a good life. Third category slave, looking after the animals, shoveling dung, doing the most menial tasks, the worst tasks. Bilal was a third category slave. And his job, apart from everything else he had to do during the day, was during the night he had to knead the dough for his master. So he would be given so much, and there was no sleeping until it was done. And it wasn't just a small amount. It would have to be for the master and all his family and so on and so forth. And if it wasn't done, he didn't sleep. This was his existence. Then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a man would turn up and would assist him. Now Bilal is a slave. He's not going to question, who are you, where did you come from, why are you here, did the master send you? He's happy that someone's come and he's happy that someone's helping him. This man would come, would help him, and Bilal wouldn't question. So that night Bilal got to go to sleep early, and his burden was lightened. The next day Bilal radiallahu anhu thought, if this guy comes, I'm going to bring more. Right? More flour. So he brought more flour, and this guy turned up. And again, finished the job, and Bilal's now ahead. He's not questioning anything. He's a third category slave. The third night, the same thing. He brings more. After 3 nights, Bilal, he can't take it anymore. He says, who are you? He says, I'm Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. On the spot, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Bilal knows. Bilal has heard his masters cursing and swearing, the same ones who tortured him later, cursing and swearing about a person called Muhammad who was doing this and who was doing that, backbiting. People talk in the house, and Bilal heard everything that they said, whatever image they tried to put and poison they tried to put in the hearts of the people, completely shattered by akhlaq. When we serve others and we don't see ourselves too good to be serving others, and this is for me and this is for all of us, it includes people of all different positions in life. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam spent time with every single type of person in society, whether they were mentally unwell. One mentally unwell woman came and grabbed him and dragged him out into the street and made him sit down into the middle of the street while she spoke to him, and he, with sabr, took the whole lot. And now when people see this, how can you not love this man? When this man comes totally unannounced, wanting absolutely nothing from you, and helps you, and what are you? You're a third category slave. This is just totally unprecedented. This is the precedent for every single good thing that anybody, any revolutionary, person who was fighting for civil rights or who was fighting for anything that came after Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the precedent. And by his example, people learnt how to be, and hearts were won. And one by one, entire nations were changed. A few traders, the whole of Indonesia. A few traders, hundreds of millions of Muslims in China. A handful of Sahaba, and Islam spreads from Ibn Abi Waqqas, who is buried in Cantong in China, to Uqba, who rode his horse into the sea at Morocco. You imagine in that time to travel to that extent with none of the the perks that we have today, air travel and media and publishing, all the things you care to imagine, and to achieve so much in such a short period of time because of their akhlaq. Because of their akhlaq. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had such an impact on them that when the Battle of Hunayn took place, then the order came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's mentioned in the Holy Quran, about giving sadaqah not just to the poor and the musafir and so on and so forth, but to those peoples whose hearts can be reconciled or should be reconciled. Those people who newly came into Islam, whether they need it or not is not the issue. Whether they are rich or poor is not the issue. But winning their hearts over with ikram. So what did Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam do to the people of Quraysh who just previously fought against him in Hunayn and now had accepted Islam? Two brothers of Abu Jahl, and people who were enemies from the very beginning, and who at their hands had caused so much harm to Muslims and to Islam. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is now giving them from the ghanima, from the spoils of war, hundreds of camels and hundreds of sheep, and to reconcile, to give them ikram. Safwan radhiyallahu anhu is walking with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam notices him, the way that he's staring at a valley, a lush valley full of livestock, camels and sheep and goats, etc. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says more or less to him that, does it please you? We know the story. He says, yes, of course. He says, it's all yours. A valley full. We're not talking, some box of chocolates or a bunch of flowers. A valley full of livestock. It's all yours. Safwan, it's all yours. His reaction is that there is no way that anyone other than a prophet could possibly spend so easily and not fear poverty. It made his heart firm. Ikram made his heart firm. And like I said, two brothers of Abu Jahl were also given. And so many who were very, very wealthy to start with. There was no shortage of, camels and so on and so forth in what they owned. But the interesting thing is that those who were the Muhajirin and the Ansar, by comparison, they received very, very little. When the Ansar, that is the people of Medina, they started to see how much Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave to those who were the enemies of Allah and His Rasul up until just recently. And not only were they the enemies of Allah and His Rasul, but they were people who were very wealthy to start with. They were already wealthy, they had no need for these things. And they were human beings. So something came into their heart and they were murmuring amongst themselves. On average, they got 4 camels or the equivalent thereof in sheep and goats and so on and so forth. And these guys are getting hundreds, man. So Ubadah radhiyallahu anhu, he goes to Rasulullah Sa'ad bin Ubadah radhiyallahu anhu, he goes to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he floats this sentiment from the Ansar. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam asks him, more or less in my own words, so how do you feel about this? He says, I'm one of them. It's not easy. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was rejected by them, and he was persecuted by them, and he was kicked out of Mecca by them. And they're the ones that accepted him, and they're the ones that gave their lives, and they're the ones that protected him, and they're the ones that opened their houses for him, and not only opened their houses, but opened themselves up to attack, opened themselves up to threats from the entire Arab world, the Arab peninsula that existed at that time. And now the time comes where everyone's accepting Islam, and there's heaps and heaps of booty, ghanima, and these guys, we just don't understand, we just don't get it. Not only they were the enemies yesterday, but they're wealthy, they don't need it. And we only got 4 camels each, or the equivalent thereof. Then Rasulullah said to Sa'ad, that called the Ansar. So they went into one small place, enclave, where they'd kept some prisoners of war. And he addressed them in my own words. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to them more or less that, did I not find you in dalalat? and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guided you? Did I not find you astray and Allah guided you? Poor and Allah enriched you? Fighting and squabbling amongst yourselves, hating one another, killing one another, completely disunity amongst yourselves, and Allah united you? And they said, yes, wallahi, yes, absolutely, it's true. And they were quiet. Then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to them more or less, but why don't you give the rebuttal? Why don't you give me the rebuttal? And they were puzzled. He says, what do you mean? Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, you could easily reply to me, and you would be very justified in doing so, and you would have every right to do so, to say that, Ya Rasulullah, you were rejected, and we accepted you. You were cast out, and we embraced you. You were forlorn with nobody, and we came and we helped and we gave and we did everything. You would have every right to say this. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam then said that, is it not just, is it not proper, in my own words, that they should have the things of this world whereby their hearts can be reconciled, and they can come close to Islam by this means, and that when everyone else goes home with their sheep and their goats and their cattle and their camels and their buffaloes and whatnot, that you go home with the Prophet of Allah? Is this not a fair trade? Is this not sufficient for you? And he said more things to this extent, until they wept and they wept and they wept and they wept, and their beards became wet with tears. But when you win the heart of a person, you don't have to subsidize your relationship with material things. But we today, because we don't have the akhlaq of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we find ourselves constantly having to subsidize our relationship with others and with our wives and with our children with material things. You know, the wife asked for this and the wife asked for that, and we said, oh, the wives of the Prophet, you know, they, for 2 months, Aisha radiallahu anha, she only saw the two black things, water and dates. And you want, you know, prime cut beef, and you want the best things in the house, and you want this, that and everything else. She should reply, if you had the akhlaq of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I wouldn't ask for these things, because I would be happy with you. As far as getting akhlaq, it's not easy, but it's not impossible, and it's a lifelong battle. And there are a few things that we can do that by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's tawfiq, inshallah, we can improve. First, we need to learn our deen. We need to learn more about Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, inspired by his example, inspired by the example of the Sahaba. When we read the seerah and we read the character of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he never beat anyone in anger, not even children, which, you know, I mean, we're just hopeless when it comes to these things. The only time he raised his hand was when it was in battle against the enemies of Allah or for Sharia. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was generous, so much so that the people were astonished that he just gave and gave and gave and gave and gave and never feared poverty. If we learn from his example, we can then at least try and imitate his example. If we don't know about him and we haven't read about him, we don't know about his life, then we have no blueprint. We can only go by what we see around us, which is just not even second hand, third hand. Then there comes the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam advised one particular sahabi. He said, don't always travel with just your own kind. Don't always mingle with just your own kind. You know, Pakis with Pakis and Arabs with Arabs, and you just hang around your own little crowd. You know, Bosnians are in one corner only talking amongst themselves, and we don't mingle amongst themselves, which is the beauty of this masjid, that is very, very cosmopolitan. And alhamdulillah, many people from many different backgrounds, different nationalities and different views can coexist in this masjid with harmony. And this is something which is, believe me, and Allah has blessed me by being able to travel to many places in Australia. This is something which is very, very rare, unfortunately. The hadith comes that don't always hang around your own crowd, more or less in my own words, but travel with different people Mix with different people, with different company, with different tribes, with different crowds, because it will improve your akhlaq. Different people, different mentalities. You will have to make sabr. And through sabr you will get qualities. And your mind will be opened to different views and different ways and different ideas. And that will improve your qualities. Serving other people, khidmah, gives a person qualities. If all our life we have only been served, you will find that anybody, generally speaking, who has lived that sort of life, the more that their life has been like that, the more you will find that they tend to be corrupt as an individual. Spoiled. And the more that a person serves others, with ikhlas of course, the underlying thing with everything that we do has to be with ikhlas. Because if you do anything for some worldly gain and it doesn't bear fruits, then we will give it up. I did such and such and it didn't work, I did such and such, they didn't appreciate it, I did such and such, I didn't achieve what I wanted, and you give it up. And therefore that road to developing akhlaq and developing qualities and stuff will stop. The more others serve us, the more we become spoiled. The more we serve others for the sake of Allah. They praise us, alhamdulillah. They don't praise us, they criticize us, alhamdulillah. We don't be stupid and allow ourselves to be burnt and burnt and burnt and burnt by people who are ungrateful. It's not what's meant. But we do something for somebody and they appreciate it, alhamdulillah, it's from Allah. We do something for somebody else and they don't appreciate it, it's also from Allah. And if you did it from Allah, then the reward is with Allah. The more we serve others, the more we will develop qualities. These are just a few things anyway. I will stop there because I understand that such is the time limit. May Allah give us, this is a topic which really is very hard to speak on, because like I said in the beginning, when you are qualified in something it's easy to talk about it, right? But when you don't have akhlaq yourself, it's very, very hard to say this is how we should be. So we are all in this boat where we all need to improve. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all the ability, inshallah, to realize that we and the way we project ourselves, especially in the environment that we're in, is less forgiving than if we were living in, for example, a Muslim country. Because here we're signaled out, okay, whether we like it or not. Because, why? You know, people complain in the news, so-and-so did something and so-and-so did something, and then if it's a Muslim that did something, they will say a Muslim did something. And I thought about that, and it's for a very good reason why that happens. When, for example, some other nationality, some non-Muslim, does such and such, right? He doesn't necessarily represent anything, right? But when a Muslim does something, perhaps what we don't realize, whether we like it or not, we actually represent something. We actually represent Allah and His Rasul and the Book of Allah. And therefore it makes sense, understanding that when we do something wrong, people stipulate it was a Muslim who did such and such. So it's not their fault. It's actually our shortcoming that we haven't realized that we represent something. Whereas if an Irishman does something wrong, they don't say that Irish Catholic terrorist. Because he's not really representing anything. But if you're a Muslim, you're representing the last ummah, the khairul ummah, the best ummah that has ever set foot on this earth. And we, because we are being watched, we are duty bound to work on our akhlaq. Not for the sake of impressing others, but for the sake of pleasing Allah. If we have good akhlaq because we expect that others will accept Islam through us, if they don't accept Islam, then what? No, we do it for Allah. And if Allah chooses that others should accept Islam through us, then that's a bonus. If others are, like I said earlier, if others are, you know, what's the word for it? Grateful, then alhamdulillah. And if they're not grateful, then it's between them and Allah. May Allah give us tawfiq, inshallah. Jazakallahu khair. Subhanak.